So, hi Lauren, thank you for joining me today. It's really great to speak to you and really looking forward to getting your thoughts on everything accessibility, disability, and digital accessibility. So, before we begin, can you just share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Thanks for having me. I'm Lauren. I'm originally from Melbourne, but I now live in Wellington, Aotearoa, New Zealand. So kia ora to any Kiwis watching. And yeah, I am totally blind, have been since birth. So I'm a Braille reader and a screen reader user, and I work as a freelance digital and arts accessibility consultant. So what does that actually mean? So in the digital space, I audit websites and apps to make sure that they meet the web content accessibility guidelines, but also going beyond that to meet best practice recommendations as well. And then in the arts world, I work a lot with theatre makers and artists around making performances and exhibitions accessible, particularly for blind and low vision audiences, and also advocate a little bit for disabled artists as well to make sure that their workplace environment, so whether it's a theatre or a gallery or wherever they're working, making sure that their access requirements are being met as well.
That's awesome. Now, moving back to the digital side of things, can you talk us through for anybody who might not have come across a blind person who uses the internet and accesses digital content? How do you access digital content in the online space?
Yeah, so I use what's called a screen reader, which in its kind of simplest explanation is software that you install onto your computer or your phone. And if you're using Android or Apple, they come with speech software out of the box. So it's not like we have to go and purchase anything separately, which we did back in the day before the iPhone and Android phones were in existence. We had to buy expensive software to install onto our phones. And with the Mac, there's software that comes with that as well, speech software, and as well on Windows, there's also software that comes with that you can run. But with Windows 2, there is also separate software that you can download or purchase that's been created for blind people. So it's good. There's lots of choice around, I guess, how we access the internet and digital content these days, but essentially a screen reader will speak the content on screen aloud. So it will tell you, you can read your emails, your Word documents, you can browse the internet. Of course, this is assuming that everything has been designed well, because if something has been designed poorly, then a screen reader is not going to interact well with that product. But let's assume that it has been designed well. Yeah, we can do our online shopping, our banking. I run my business independently, all with the use of a screen reader. I don't use a mouse. I will use a keyboard to do everything. So with lots of keyboard shortcuts to help me access different parts of a web page. So it's not necessarily going from top to bottom. We can look at different parts of a page really quickly, whether that's different headings for content or looking, knowing what's in the header or the footer content of a page, or filling in a form. There's all these different keyboard shortcuts that we have at our disposal to access different components of digital content, if you like.
Fantastic. And what's the learning curve like? I know, just getting on and learning how to use a computer is one barrier for some people often. So what's the learning curve like when you have to access a computer but learn a whole new tool to do so?
It's just what I've always known. I remember it was a bit of a big jump going from using, I think the first computer that I had ran MS-DOS, because this was back in like in the early 90s. And then I switched to Windows 98 in high school and got my first Windows screen reader then. And that was a big learning curve because my old DOS computer didn't have the internet or anything. So there was a whole lot of new things to learn, but I picked it up very quickly because I was keen to communicate with my friends. Everybody, like a lot of my other blind friends, were really confidently using email, and this was the days of ICQ and MSN Messenger, and I really wanted to talk to people online, and so that was a really good motivator to learn. And I think I just learned a lot by doing and talking to other blind friends who were using screen readers to get their tips and tricks. And yeah, so that was what, a good kind of 27 years ago or something now that I've, yeah.
That ICQ sound, as soon as you said it, started popping up in my head.
Little ow noise that it used to make.
So, how does poor digital accessibility affect your independence, dignity, or participation?
I think, yeah, it's so frustrating when you're using a website, and maybe I'll use an example to illustrate. I had to go to the dentist recently, like, you know, which is, no one likes a dentist. So I was feeling kind of anxious about that. It was a new dentist as well, so there was kind of that whole anxiety around, what are they going to be nice to me? Are they like a non-judgmental dentist because, you know, I'm not regular with my flossing and all of that stuff. And I had to fill in a form, a new patient form, and it was like relatively accessible. I mean, there were a few things that could have been done better, but overall I got the job done. I answered all the questions, I ticked all the boxes that they needed ticking, I wrote all the things that had to be written in the appropriate form field, and then I got to the very last question, which was, please sign to agree to our terms and conditions and consent and all that stuff. And there was a box where you had to sign either with one of those like stylus pens, or you could use your finger to sign on the screen. And it just was not accessible. I tried just putting my finger randomly on the screen and trying to sign. I switched from my laptop to my phone, turned the speech off, and signed where I hoped there was a signature box, and it just did not work at all. And so I left the form completed on my phone, and I took it to the dentist, and I had to say to the reception staff, like, I could fill in all of your form, but I couldn't sign it. Can you? And they had to help me. And even they had trouble. And it was a really interesting experience, actually, because when they were looking at it to try and show me where to sign, they were like, actually, this is really hard to see. Like, they'd never had to fill it in as dental staff before. So then they realized, actually, visually, there was problems with the signature box too. And so I think we ended up printing it, and then they had to help me to sign it that way. But it was just like a whole lot of extra extra steps for something that could have been solved really easily, or, you know, I could have ticked a box to agree to the terms and conditions. Like, it probably really didn't need a signature, but it was, yeah. And I'm seeing a lot more of that these days. Or just yeah, just not being able to complete. I think forms is a really big one, and then you having to ask for cited assistance, when if it was designed accessibly from the beginning, there would be no reason to need to do that.
That's really interesting, and I guess it brings up that whole thing of the time cost of disability. I'm doing a number of these interviews, and everyone's kind of mentioned the amount of time it takes to do something that you know, somebody with mobility, somebody with vision, it's such an easy thing to do. You know, one person mentioned that he used to go to the football and he'd just jump online and get his ticket and have his seat, and that was fine. And now he's a wheelchair user, so he now has to call up and let them know that he's a wheelchair user, and then he gets allocated a seat, but he doesn't know exactly where he's sitting in the stadium until he gets there, and they allocate him a spot. And so I guess that's something that is not often thought about, is the time cost of disability, and how, you know, making things accessible just saves so much time for you that you can be using doing other things.
Exactly. And I think the anxiety that it can cause as well, like, speaking of tickets, I was booking something through one of the big ticketing companies the other day, and it had a time limit on it. So I'd chosen my seats, and then I got to the payment screen, and there were a few steps involved, and each step had, like, I think the first one had 3 minutes to complete it, and the next one was 4 minutes, and then the last one was like 5 minutes or something. And I've done this enough times now that I've got it pretty well covered, and I can get through it really quickly. But when I first booked with this company, I was booted out a couple of times because I didn't complete everything in the time frame, and there was no option to extend the time limit. And I had to go back and do the whole process again a couple of times. So it was meant to take 10 minutes, took like half an hour. And there was there's always anxiety around that when I book, because I think, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to complete it in the allocated time? So access anxiety is definitely a thing as well.
Absolutely. And what about access fatigue? So, constantly trying to get things made accessible or having to advocate for yourself, or like you said, filling out that dental form and then having to go in, and all the extra time that it took for you to explain that you couldn't fill it out, and then I guess all the extra time that it took for them to talk about how poorly designed the form was altogether. How do you find that access fatigue shows up in your life? And if so, how? And what do you think would be a good way to relieve some of that?
I mean, just designing accessibly from the beginning would be a great way to relieve some of that. And consulting with disabled people really early on in the process, even kind of at the design stage. Don't wait until it's done and then bring people in. Do it much, much earlier. I mean, there's not going to be a website that is perfectly accessible for everyone, but if you can get it close enough, that's a really great start, because yeah, access fatigue does show up a lot. I think physically as well as digitally. So it might be that, like with a digital form, like the one we just talked about with the dentist, you get all the way through and you think, great, I've done it, and then there's just like the one question that you can't complete, whether it's a signature or a checkbox that hasn't been designed properly, so you can't tick the final question to then submit the form, and you have to find workarounds, which not everybody is able to do if you're not as tech savvy. Or it may be that you're, I don't know, doing some shopping. Clothes shopping, for example, is a good one. So often websites don't necessarily have good descriptions of the items of clothing that you're looking at. And so what I've taken to doing now is getting the images of the clothes that I'm thinking of purchasing and using AI to describe them for me and making my decisions based on those descriptions, which is great in some ways. Previously, I would have had to have maybe sent photos to a friend or just like gone into the store to look at a product which has its own kind of access fatigue, because it's like getting there and maybe it's in an unfamiliar environment, and then you've got to get some assistance from people that work at the store and you hope that they're going to be good at describing things. So having the AI has in some ways taken out some of the hassle, but it's still extra steps that other people don't have to go through. So if you could just describe the clothes that you're selling in really detailed ways that would make sense to someone who might not be able to see them, then that would eliminate some of the steps and the time that we talked about before. That cost in time would be really helpful. And I think I often don't think about the access fatigue because I'm so used to coming across inaccessible products and you just think, oh, here we go, here's another one. But yeah, when I think about all the time that I could have saved and the anxiety that could have been prevented if things had been accessible from the beginning, it would be a lot, I think.
Yeah, I can imagine. So does your blindness affect your use of websites and apps, or is it the way that things are built that cause barriers for you?
It's definitely the way that things are built. My blindness itself generally isn't really a barrier to accessing things. It's the way that things are designed or not designed properly. Again, the clothing example, going onto a website and seeing a bunch of images with no descriptions and not knowing what I'm looking at, or looking through a website where the links or buttons may not be labeled correctly, so I'm not sure what I'm going to be pressing, or if I'm entering on a link, where am I going to be taken? So if the access was thought about from the beginning, then there would be no barriers for me in how I access digital content.
So you mentioned before, having a lot of businesses really have a desire to do better, but often funding and things get in the way. If you had a magic wand and could design the ideal digital experience with no limits on time, money, or technology, what would make something truly accessible for you?
Gosh, it's the kind of $1 million question, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, just the money and the time to have disabled people involved in the process from the beginning, seeing more disabled people across, because it's such a systemic thing as well. So having disabled people involved in the development cycles, being employed in across more sectors, being involved in leadership positions, because as I said, the change needs to be systemic. And then, yeah, just having, I'm going to get a little bit technical, but in terms of good digital experience, having really good semantic structure from the beginning. So making sure that everything means something when you're navigating through a page, that all images are described, that all video content has audio description if people want it, and giving people choice about how they access their digital content and making sure that that's all accessible. So some people prefer mobile, some people prefer desktop, and sometimes one of those things might be accessible but the other one isn't. So there are so many things. I feel like I can't pinpoint one particular thing or one kind of magic wand wave and we'd have everything accessible.
Yeah.
There's so many moving parts.
Is there a small design change that could make websites and apps more usable for you?
I think the biggest thing would be labeling of elements. So your links, your buttons, your form fields, your checkboxes, like anything that you can interact with, label it properly so that we know what it is that we're interacting with and make sure that we can actually interact with it. So can we type into a form field? Can we can we enter on a button or a link with a keyboard and not just have to use a mouse? All of those things. And they're really, really straightforward changes that can be made. I know that some people will say, oh, but they're really like complex changes. When we get down to it, they are really simple things that people can do.
Yeah, I think sometimes we make them more complex than they need to be. If
Yeah.
we drill back to what is this element for, what does it need to do, and keep it simple like that, then we can keep it simple with the labeling and the use of them as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And one last question. What language or framing feels right for you when talking about your disability? This is something that that comes up a lot with a lot of people who aren't used to interacting with someone who has a disability. I noticed that, you know, as you were talking, you say you go to a website and you look at something and you use words like see, and I know that that makes a lot of people who do have vision really panicked that they don't want to mention those words in front of you, just in case that, you know, they offend you.
You get upset. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's something that I think it's a barrier that stops people from interacting with people that they meet just because of their own fears. So, and you know, we see a lot in the Australian language side of things where, you know, vision impaired as opposed to visually impaired. So for you, what language feels right with that framing?
Don't get too hung up on language. I mean, there'd be certain things I'd probably say no to. I remember a number of years ago now in the UK, vision impairment was described as serious sight problems or something. And I think I'd draw the line at things like that, or sort of really archaic language that we don't use anymore. But in terms of like whether you're a person with a disability or a disabled person, I don't really get caught up in that because it's different even between countries. Like in New Zealand, disabled person is more commonly used than person with a disability, whereas in Australia it's the other way around, although it's mixed now. I'm seeing kind of both used. And so it's really about like what the individual person wants, because even within the community of people with disabilities, there'll be differing views around what language should be used. So I think it's always good if people want to check. But in terms of like see and look, those kinds of words, I use them all the time and I don't think about them because I'm seeing and looking just in a different way to how a sighted person would. And I think just use the language that you normally would, but check in with people if you want to. But I think don't panic too much, because if that anxiety is going to prevent you with interacting with someone with disability, then that's, you know, I don't want the language to be a barrier, I guess. I think people just need to calm down a little bit around use of language, because we get so focused on it and then we just kind of miss some of the bigger issues that are at play.
We're creating barriers for ourselves when they're up there already. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a good talk and always really good to talk to you. I've always said you're one of my favorite voices. You have the best ASMR voice out there. So I was really looking forward to chatting with you today. But really appreciate your time and your insights and your feedback.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Charlii.